Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is a little bit of a learning curve for me, trying to balance speaking to people live again. Baruch Hashem, back here in the shul, and those are on the Zoom. I'm not quite sure how one makes eye contact. Does one make eye contact also with the computer and also the people who are live, or exactly how one balances it? So please forgive me if this is a little bit of an adjustment, but it's nice to be back in shul giving shiurim again. I will try also, if people ask questions live, I'll try and repeat them to those who are on Zoom and similarly the other way around. So as per our normal format, please do feel free to ask questions. I've also got the chat enabled, so I will see if people post questions via chat, and we'll try and do it like that. So the topic I was asked to look at is actually an exceptionally sensitive and difficult one. Last term, before the summer break, I was looking at cultural and sociological and scientific impact on Chazal. In other words, to what degree were Chazal and the things they said, the ideas they expressed, the rabbinic legislation they created, the halacha that they clarified, to what degree was this affected by the sociological and scientific and cultural understanding at the time? And this in and of itself is a difficult enough topic, but I was asked to explore the same topic in terms of Torah SheBichtav, in terms of the written law and the Doraisa law itself, Torah Shebal-Peh, Torah SheBichtav itself. Is it possible? And if yes, to what degree could there be historic and cultural impact on the Torah SheBichtav, on the written Torah itself? So that was the topic I was asked to look at. And this is a very difficult topic, multiple times more difficult than looking at the Drabonon equivalent of it. And there's several reasons for this. The first is that we're obviously going back much further in time. We know a lot about the sort of sociological and historical circumstances in Bavel, for example, at the time that the Talmud Bavli was being written. We know a lot about the post-Churban Roman rule time in occupied Eretz Yisrael at the time that the Mishnah was being written. We know much, much less about the Tanoim pre the destruction of the temple. There's about 200 years of history post-Chanukah, pre-Churban Beis HaMikdash, for various reasons, about which we know very little about the transmission of Torah Shebal-Peh. But we know infinitely less, obviously, about the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim and the time of the giving of the written Torah. So this is one challenge when we want to look at this issue. Similarly, a second challenge is that we're not talking here about a work of human creation. We're talking about a work of godly creation. We're talking about the Torah SheBichtav, the Torah Shebal-Peh. We're not talking about the Rabbanons here. And therefore, when we talk about historic and cultural and sociological impact on Torah SheBichtav, on the written Torah, we really need to clarify what exactly we mean by that. Why should we expect that to be there when we're talking about a work given by a being who is above time and space? So the whole topic really needs clarification. Is there any share to give on this subject at all? Or is that the share? The Torah is given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem by definition is above time and space, and nothing further needs to be said around the subject. Yes, Julian?
So here you seem to be distinguishing between Torah and Nach.
For now, I'm talking about Torah SheBichtav, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and Torah Shebal-Peh. That was given at Sinai, as opposed to Nach. But I will make a note of your point. Julian just asked about Nach, and are we distinguishing between Nach? And this is also something that we could discuss, and maybe I'll try and touch on. Thank you. I'll add that on at the as we draw to a close in this series. So what do we mean when we're talking about a Torah influenced by culture and history and sociology? Is there anything to talk about at all? The third point to mention is that we are also treading on, treading on fire, I think that's the expression, but we're also playing with fire. Sorry, we're playing with fire in this topic because the Rambam comes close to indicating that we're talking here about Ikrei Emunah, about fundamentals of faith. Now, what do I mean by that? Rambam doesn't anywhere say there's no historic or cultural impact or sociological impact from the time on the Torah. In fact, we'll see later that maybe the Rambam believed there was, but the Rambam does stress to us the eternity of Torah. Torah is for all time and all places. So were we to understand the Torah to just be dealing with a particular set of historic circumstances, applicable only in a certain time and space, we're edging close to fundamentals of faith according to the Rambam. Now, in other settings, we've discussed the Ikrei Emunah, not in this series of the Sunday morning, but I did a series on Wednesday nights a while back, many years back actually, on the Ikrei Emunah, and to what degree there's room for debate around them, and to what degree there's discussion around them. These are all very fascinating and interesting topics. At the end of the day, when you're talking about one of the Yudkim and Ikrim that the Rambam lists, one certainly needs to be cautious. Now, what exactly does the relevant Ikka say, and what doesn't it say? So we're talking here about the 9th of the 13 principles of faith. And the Rambam, the principles of faith really fall into several categories. The first lot of the Ikrei Emunah are about Hashem, nothing to do with revealed religion, just that there's a first cause who's above time and space, who's infinite, who doesn't have a body, the basic tenets of monotheism. The final set of Ikrei Emunah deal with reward and punishment, Olam Haba, Chiyas HaMesim, that actually we have discussed here on our Sunday morning series. But the middle set talk about the interaction between the infinite and the finite, the interaction between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and human beings, primarily Torah SheBichtav, the written Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, Nevuah, Nach, the concept of prophecy, revelation, these sort of Nevuah of Moshe, the superiority of the prophecy of Moshe, these sorts of topics. This is what the middle set of the Ikrei Emunah clarify. And in the middle of those is the 9th Ikka, in which the Rambam talks about the immutability, the unchangeability, the eternity of the Torah. Now, the formula with which we are most familiar is the Kachlim, the brief summary of the Yudkim and Ikrim in the Ani Mamin form at the back of the Siddur. And in that form, and also in the Yigdal form, which is the other shortened version of the 13 Principles of Faith, it says very clearly, I believe with perfect faith, this Torah will never be changed. There will never be another Torah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this Torah is eternal, it will never be changed. Now, of course, this is a dig at Christianity, right? A Christian belief. We believe that there was a second testament, a second covenant, a second bris, a second giving of the Torah. This is what, but either way, this is what the Rambam says as one of the Ikrei Emunah. In the Yigdal form, we're also familiar with the poetic representation of this. HaKadosh Baruch will not alter the law and not change it, and forever and ever. He will never change the Torah. So this is the idea of the eternity of Torah. And certainly, therefore, if we begin locating the Torah in a time and place, and fall into the assumption that it's circumstantial and therefore only applies in a particular historic circumstance, we're coming dangerously close to saying the Torah now alters to adapt to new circumstances and therefore doesn't apply in an eternal manner. So we have to think exactly what we mean in this whole topic of the Shir, and this is a third reason why this topic is sensitive. When one looks interesting at the fuller formulation written by the Rambam himself, it's actually a little less clear cut. The Ikrei Emunah in the summary form, the Ikrei Emunah, the fundamentals of faith in the summary form, as we've discussed before on Sunday morning, were not written by the Rambam himself. They were written much later as a summary of the 13 Principles of Faith. The Rambam wrote his own version of the 13 Principles of Faith twice. Once in Arabic in his Perush Mishnayos, in his commentary to Mishnayos, in his introduction to one of the final parokim of Sanhedrin, in which the Mishnah in Sanhedrin talks about those who don't have a portion in the come. And there the Rambam, in his introduction to his commentary on these Mishnayos, talks at length about what are the fundamentals that Jews need to believe. And the Rambam also in his Mishnah Torah, in his great halachic work, this time in Hebrew, also writes what defines the parameters of correct belief and heresy. And again, I think we've discussed in the Sunday morning series, in the pre-Zoom world, I think we discussed what we mean by the concept of heresy, and does everyone have to believe everything, and what do we do about people who don't believe? I'm not going into any of that now. For now, my interest is simply assuming the list of the Rambam, the 13 principles of faith, are pretty important and central, and we're going to take them on as for the purposes of this year as axiomatic. So what does the Rambam actually say in his own works? So in the Mishnah, in the commentary to the Mishnah, he says a slightly perhaps reduced version of this. He says this Torah has been faithfully transmitted from the Creator. I'll say it in English actually, because he wrote in Arabic, so whether we read it in Hebrew or English, it's a translation, unless one reads it in the original Arabic, which I'm not capable of. He says this Torah has been faithfully transmitted from the Creator, meaning to say corruption hasn't crept into it. I don't think in this setting, but on my Wednesday night series, I spoke about biblical criticism and to what degree the text of the Torah is accurate and so on. That's a sort of semi-related topic. He says the text hasn't been corrupted. This, of course, is a dig at the second Abrahamic faith, Islam, who believe that the version of Torah that we have has become corrupted. The Rambam says it hasn't been corrupted. And then he says, nor can anything be added to it, nor taken away from it, which is really the pasuk in Devarim, Yud Gimel, Lo Sosif Olav V'lo Sikra Mimenu. Don't add to the Torah and don't take away from it. So if we just saw the Rambam in his commentary to the Mishnayos version, we could simply think he's saying the Torah hasn't been corrupted, number one. And number two, we shouldn't add or take away mitzvahs. In other words, a limit to rabbinic authority or interpretive authority, not to remove mitzvahs or add to them, which obviously opens another whole discussion about what exactly a rabbinic ordinance is and how Chazal create mitzvahs, which I think I touched upon when we looked at Torah Sheba'al Peh. But again, it seems a slightly more limited formulation of what this fundamental of faith means. Nonetheless, in his Mishnah Torah, in his halachic work, the Rambam lists those who are considered kofrim, those who are considered non-believers in Elo Shloshim HaKofrim Torah. There are three who are heretics in the Torah, who deny the authority of the Torah, and the final one that the Rambam who lists is the Omer, the one who says Shabara Hichlif Mitzvah Zu B'Mitzvah Cheres, that Hashem substituted one mitzvah for another mitzvah, etc. And he says this is also a form of heresy. In the non-censored version of the Mishnah Torah, he says explicitly, not like the Christians and the Arabs who believe that the Torah was either corrupted or altered. So the Rambam certainly speaks about the eternity of the Torah and the Torah values. So in this topic, we need to think a little bit about what we mean when we talk about Torah being affected by particular historic or sociological circumstances. So what we've said so far is that the topic of the Shia is a parallel discussion in a sense to the one we had about Chazal. It can one say, and if yes, to what degree has history or sociology or sociological culture impacted on what the Torah says? This is complicated, perhaps more complicated than talking about Chazal. Number one, because the history is much further back, we know much less about it. And number two, because we're talking about an eternal God who obviously is above history. That's a basic belief in how we understand monotheism. And number three, because the Rambam understands the Torah to be eternal as declared by the Torah itself. So how do we have this whole conversation within the parameters of the 13 principles of faith? And we looked a little bit at the 13 principles of faith, the 9th Ikar, in which the Rambam speaks about this immutability of Torah. The fourth reason why this is a complicated subject, and here we're now getting to the core of some of the things that need to be said, is because the question is phrased poorly. And obviously, we need to think, what do we mean about a cultural or sociological or impact or historical impact on the Torah? And if we clarify the question a bit better, I think we'll understand that there's certainly aspects of the question that aren't in the least controversial. Let me give you a few examples of that. When we talk about the expression of the values of the Torah, clearly, to some degree, at least the form through which they're expressed is affected by historical circumstances. No one is bothered by the idea that in multiple mitzvahs in the Torah, probably the largest single collection of mitzvahs in the Torah are Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, or in memory and in commemoration of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now, Yetzias Mitzrayim was a historic event that took place. It took place in a certain form, in a certain manner, affected by free human agency and how individuals chose to react, whether these individuals are Yosef and his brothers, whether they're Yaakov, when we talk about the descent to Egypt, whether it's Paro and the role he played, whether it's Egyptian society, whether it's the Jewish response, whether it's Moshe and Aaron's response, whether it's the Zakanim. There's a whole series of players in the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, all of which combine into a particular historic sequence, which results in Yetzias Mitzrayim and the Exodus from Egypt as we know it. And there's a whole realm of mitzvahs connected with Yetzias Mitzrayim. So clearly, history and events that took place impact on, to a large degree, to a significant degree, on how the Torah expresses the Taryag mitzvahs. So in its narrowest form, does history have an effect on how the Torah is delivered to us? The answer is clearly and non-controversially yes. History could have turned out very differently. The brothers could have made different decisions. Yosef could have made different decisions. And this is explicit in Chazal. Actually, we can trace the picture. This week's Sedra, Parshas Lech Lecha, Avram at the Bris Bein HaBesorim, B'Ma'ida. There's a very, very difficult and mystical covenant, which Avram enters into, the covenant of the parts, where he falls into a tardema, a very deep sleep, and he has some sort of prophetic revelation. And he says to Hashem, asks questions to Hashem on it, and Hashem says the famous words of Ger Zaracha, Ba'ayat Lahem, your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. And this is the key covenantal and prophetic text that tells us about the eventual exodus down to Egypt, Arba Me'ah Shana, 400 years, and so on and so forth. And even in that conversation, Chazal understands it's influenced by how Avram chooses, crucial word, chooses to respond. So every stage, many of the key players, if not all of the key players, have bechira, have choice in how they respond, and this affects how history plays out. So the idea that Torah is completely sort of above history in the sense that the expression of the mitzvahs, of the Taryag mitzvahs and how they play out, the idea that this is somehow completely ahistorical isn't correct. So what sounds initially like a very cutting, edgy question, pushing boundaries, at least in its narrowest formulation, shouldn't be seen as super controversial at all. Obviously, how the Taryag mitzvahs are expressed is impacted on by historic events. Yes.
So the whole point about the Jewish times, they happened before Master Torah. So sort of things were concretized, formalized. Torah had an understanding might have been redefined before formulation, etc.
Right.
So in a sense, what happened before you see times or context?
Yes.
So Master Torah, so that's sort of the baseline that we understand it to be. So you see it's
Right.
Story contextual, it's pre-Master Torah. So relevance maybe
Yes.
to the question to say within historical context, maybe it's for that before we give.
Yes. So Neil here is asking that this is perhaps context, and context is obviously affects how the Torah is given, and crucially, it's also pre-Matan Torah context, and therefore again maybe this is okay because it's pre-Matan Torah context. Now this is a fair point. It is pre-Matan Torah context. Nonetheless, in the narrowest formulation of the question, we see that there is impact on the historical circumstances on how the Torah is expressed. More than that, there's also post-Matan Torah effect on the Torah. Now, this certainly has an effect on the narrative portion of the Torah, because the narrative portion of the Torah obviously contains events that took place post-Matan Torah, the story of the Meraglim, the story of Korach, and so on and so forth. And it also has an effect on how mitzvahs themselves are framed. So, for example, the Torah lists a mitzvah not to be a Baal Machlokas, not to be engaged in a certain sort of argument and friction and split in Klal Yisrael, whatever exactly the parameters of this prohibition are. But the Torah phrases it as V'lo si'aka Korach u'chadoso, don't be like Korach and his Ada, like his flock, don't engage in a certain sort of machlokas. According to many of the Rishonim, this is one of the Taryag mitzvahs, one of the 613 commandments. So again, there you have a commandment at least formulated by a particular set of historic circumstances. Neil also referenced perhaps a source that I should have said and could have said, which is not from a halachic context, but from more midrashic or agadic context, in which it talks about the Torah existing kodem matan Torah, the Torah being in the language of the Zohar and the Mekabalim, a blueprint of creation in the language of Chazal. Elsewhere, Alpine Shana, the Torah is given 2,000 years before creation. So certainly other sources that suggest that we should see the Torah as somehow ahistoric, completely removed from history. And yet clearly there's very large chunks of the Torah which are not ahistoric, but are part of the development of history. So what do we make of this on the narrowest formulation of the question? What we've demonstrated is that the narrowest formulation of the question should not be seen as controversial. It's not a difficult question. It's fundamental. You just read the Torah and you see it's impacted by history. And yet the Rambam tells us in his halachic work, and midrashic sources tell us midrashically, that the Torah is above history and above time and space. So the simplest answer to this question is that the formulation, the language, the nusach, the way it is expressed is affected by history, but the core value behind it isn't. So in the context of Mitzrayim, the themes of Egypt are things which are valuable, important for the Torah to express, no matter what historical generation, no matter how they historically express themselves, whether freedom, bitachon, emunah, Hashem's control of history, and so on. The particular shape that it takes is affected by how history played out. Let me give you an example of this in a much drier halachic realm. The Torah teaches us, and this is another example of clearly historic impact on how the Torah expresses itself. The Torah teaches us a very sophisticated and complicated system of monetary law and damages and the like. And this is expressed in terms of historical and cultural circumstances. So Torah says if an ox gores a cow, what's the compensation and how do you pay up for that? Now, very few of us ever in our lives would encounter oxes goring cows. And we can imagine as history develops, this may cease to be a shayla completely. Maybe now it still is very, very rarely in, agricultural kibbutzim in Israel or something of the sort. But probably most rabbonim in their careers and most dayanim will never encounter the shayla in this particular form. And yet we're able to derive, right? We learn Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, Baba Basra, and we learn a whole sophisticated system of monetary law from which we derive principles which can be applied to Google cars, or self-driving cars damaging each other. And there's no problem. This is how police can deal with this the whole time. The Botei Din take the core principles which found their way through the Gemara, into the Rambam, into the Shulchan Aruch, down to modern day Pesach, and are able to paskin it. So again, in the narrowest sense, what we have is a clear example of history impacting on the Torah. Because had the Torah been given in 2021, presumably the same halachic principles would have been expressed differently, possibly. I mean, this is speculation, but certainly it looks like the halachic principles are expressed based upon certain sets of historic circumstances. And again, none of us worry about this because we understand. And every legal system is like this, by the way. This isn't, in this sense, it's not unique to Torah. There's no problem in modern day English or applying common law, which may deal with completely different circumstances. And that's the art of law, the how law works. You draw out the legal principles from however it's expressed, whichever society, and then you apply it to the new circumstances. The difference, of course, is that in an evolving legal system, in a secular legal system, there may be explicitly new law made to deal with new circumstances, whereas in our legal system, we'll apply the classic halacha and work out how to apply it to modernity. So in that sense, again, this isn't controversial. The Torah clearly deals, in Neil's excellent work, actually context, right? The point is there's a context. The context is before Matan Torah, but perhaps even after Matan Torah, at least until the entry into the land of Israel. By definition, any other context beyond that, not. And Torah at that point is now fixed in terms of the core delivery of the messages of Torah. And henceforth, we apply Torah to the new circumstances, but there isn't anything in and of in itself controversial about the idea that it expresses a context. So what is the topic then of this shir? So we spent 29 minutes discussing why the topic of the shir at first sight seems scary and worrying and edging close to what the Rambam says is one of the Ikrei Emunah. We then spent the next few minutes discussing how, in its narrowest formulation, there doesn't seem to be a problem with this question at all. And we take it for granted, so for granted that none of us have ever thought about it. None of us have a problem when we open Parshas Mishpatim, or we open Mishnais and Baba Kama or Baba Metzia, and we learn things like ox goring cows. We all understand immediately. Our mind begin going to, okay, how would we apply this to car crashes? And none of us have any issue with that. So what is the discussion, and where does it get more sensitive and more interesting? And the answer is actually the examples that were given to me when I spoke about the Drabbanans, and I see someone's posted again on the group. What happens when we get to things which are more intrinsically and fundamentally circumstantial or possibly circumstantial? Is it possible that there are certain halachas that we learn in the Torah where the core expression of the halacha itself reflects historical or sociological circumstances rather than just the example that the Torah is given? So if we accept that Yetzias Mitzrayim in a sense as an example, a change of historic events which could have happened differently, but that which brought out in the creation of the Jewish people a set of core values like emunah and trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like freedom and persecution of the vulnerable and so on and so forth, or we accept as fundamental legal principles of damages and halacha, and they're expressed through oxes and cows. But what happens when we want to look at the core message of the Torah itself? Is it possible there that there's an impact of historical and cultural circumstances on that? And we're looking here, the easiest sort of examples to look at are those where we perhaps would want to question the value behind the Torah itself in light of the world that we inhabit. So we take how we see the world and we take how the Torah sees the world, and we say, is the full clash simply a fundamental clash of values where we need to bow to the value that the Torah expresses? Or is it possible even part of the core expression of halacha itself is reflecting a particular time and place? And the example that's been given here on the chat group is the concept of the rule of slavery, which seems to have been an integral part of society then, expressed in the Torah in a halachic form. Is it possible that how the Torah conveys this and the halachic expression of how to deal with this phenomena is excuse me, is somehow impacted by the values and the circumstances of the time? So what happens when we're digging deeper? This is where the question gets interesting. This is where we're really trying to explore and understand. What happens when the question gets deeper, when we're looking at something which is an intrinsic value? Is it possible that the core message of the Torah is affected by time and space and historic circumstances, not just the sort of vocabulary or coating or veneer that the Torah uses to express its ideas? And we have touched upon this a little bit when we looked at morality in the Torah, in I think also very early in the Sunday morning. But it's a topic that deserves revisiting in the context of this series of trying to understand historic and cultural impact on the Torah. Excuse me. So this is what I wanted to look at. Any thoughts or questions before I go? Oh, yes.
Slightly different angle. Could it also be that particular interpretations of themselves, so the 12th century post-date, that interpretation, so we're not saying that the Torah itself has changed, but we are entitled to revisit that particular interpretation, which itself might have been time.
Okay, so the question that was just asked is about, is it possible that reinterpretation or a relook at interpretation of the Torah is what's called for? This really gets back into the realm of Torah SheBichtav and the interpretation of Torah. So broadly speaking, if we understand that there is a part of Torah which is directly transmitted from Sinai, certainly the text of the written Torah, and certainly part of Torah SheBichtav. In the minimalistic model of Torah SheBichtav, that what's called halacha Moshe Sinai, there are perhaps 300 odd pieces of halacha that the Gemara directly ascribes back to Sinai. So this is in a sense, in our understanding, that which is directly God's given. And this is the discussion for this series. To what degree could that be impacted by historic and cultural and sociological circumstances? Then there's a large part of Torah SheBichtav, also named Torah SheBichtav, which is interpretive. And in that sense, once it's human interpretation, we then want to know also to what degree is it some sort of pristine human interpretation removed from time and place, and to what degree are the circumstances of the interpreters impacted by their historic circumstances, and therefore to what degree can we consciously or subconsciously interpret Torah based upon how we look at things in modernity. So that really is something I touched upon when we looked at Torah SheBichtav, and maybe post this series we could relook at again and revisit as to what degree, again, I guess getting back to the previous topic, to what degree is Torah Sheba'al Peh impacted on by historic circumstances. Here, though, I'm sticking just to Torah itself in its most pristine form, as that such, yeah.
So, in another way of mentioning framing is that what the Torah describes in the form reflection of human condition. Is basically not allowed or not allowed, or isn't the Torah value. It's that people have a predisposition to oppress other people, and when that happens, you have to sort of control or regulate it. If that weren't a human condition, you wouldn't need that regulation of the law.
Okay, so Neil here is making again a very, very important point, which is, I'm actually going to step back from a point and come to it in 3-4 minutes. So if this is the question we're asking, in other words, we're asking fundamentally in terms of the core message of the Torah, is it possible it's affected by human circumstance? I reiterate what I said at the beginning, we are certainly now playing with fire. Because how do we balance this question with the idea of the eternity of Torah? And how do we balance this question with the idea of the eternity of the giver of the Torah, who clearly is above time and space? I wasn't going to get to this till later on, but given that Neil has brought this up, it's absolutely a legitimate point. Part of the answer to this question, if this is a conversation that we can have, and we'll have to see whether it is or not, is it is true. Torah is eternal. The giver of the Torah is above time and space. And I'm not going to generalize what Neil said even more holistically, but it's given to us human beings who inhabit time and space. And in that sense, perhaps it can be affected by the Makabli Torah, by the recipients of Torah, to whom it is targeted at. So I think that's a way of expressing a point, but even generalizing it even a little further, perhaps part of the answer to this question is we need to make a distinction between the Nosein HaTorah, the giver of Torah, who is clearly above time and space, the Makabli HaTorah, the recipients of Torah, who clearly do inhabit time and space and society and culture and history and everything else, and then the Torah, which is somehow the communication between the infinite and the finite, and how that interact. Now, a possible way of explaining that interaction could be a distinction between Torah SheBichtav, the written Torah, which has this sort of eternity, and Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the application of Torah to the human condition, in which case we get back to your question, which is how do we balance? Maybe the place we need to start thinking is around Torah Sheba'al Peh, but perhaps even within Torah SheBichtav, there's elements of it somehow speaking to the human condition, and therefore with the human condition being affected. So this is certainly something that we'll need to look at, but I still want to do a little bit more tightening formulation before we come on to that. Any other? Okay, so this is the introduction to the topic and a brief overview of where we might start looking around it, even though much more needs to be said. One of the primary Mara Makomas, one of the primary sources around this topic, where the Rishonim grapple with this idea, is from a thesis, an idea expressed by the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim, in his Guide to the Perplexed. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the figure in Jewish history who most explicitly started this conversation is the Rambam. Not a surprise, because this is what he sets out to do in the Moreh Nevuchim. The Rambam is exceptionally conscious of history and the impact of history on Torah, at least minimally in the non-controversial sense, but we will see shortly also in the controversial sense. Now, I gave an introduction in which I said one of the difficulties of this topic is because we don't know that much about the history at the time of the giving of the Torah. And this point is made explicitly by the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim, when he is addressing, understanding the Torah's abhorrence of Avodah Zarah, of idol worship, and many of the halachas associated with Avodah Zarah, albeit not in an obvious way. So, for example, if you look in the Torah and you learn about the prohibition against shaving the corners of your head, you look in the Torah and you learn the prohibition against tattooing. So mitzvahs, which ostensibly are quite removed from idol worship, nonetheless it's explicit in the psukim, in some cases explicit, in some cases implicit, that these are linked to prohibitions around avodah zarah. And the Rambam says, I struggle often to understand what exactly are the circumstances. Anyone who's ever learned the Seches Avodah Zarah or the Mishnayos of Avodah Zarah, some of the Halachos of Avodah Zarah, know one of the primary difficulties of learning this topic of Torah is it's very hard just to understand what exactly are the pagan practices that were being done, and exactly what was going on there, and how they were being practiced, and therefore what the halachic implications of them are. And the Rambam, who's a philosopher, is therefore also interested in understanding what's the philosophical implications of this. So clearly there was some form of pagan practice of rounding the corners of one's head or tattooing oneself. But the Rambam now wants to know, okay, how does that translate? What does that mean? What's the core value behind it that led pagans to do it that we are meant to avoid? And the Rambam says, I don't know exactly always the historic circumstances. We've lost over time. The Rambam says, I've done my best to read every book available that I can and every source available that I can on pagan practices. He writes at one point, almost the language of an oath, a promise. He says, everything I could get my hands on, I promise I've read. The Rambam read everything he could get his hands on of understanding the history to the best of his ability of what was going on around the time of Matan Torah in order to understand better Avodah Zarah. And he says, by the end of the day, we don't know. We don't know that much. He says, Halavai, if only we could have more information about what pagans were doing so that we could better understand what the Torah is coming to warn ourselves off about. So the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, a significant part of the work of the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim, in his Guide to the Perplexed, is dealing with this issue of, first of all, factually, what do we know about history, and then how does this affect our ability to understand the halachas in the Torah. But this is the non-controversial application idea. He's just trying to understand the principles of the Torah and the reasons behind the prohibitions and how they play out. But then the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim discusses the narrower version of the question, which is, to what degree can we say there are specific halachas which were directly engaging with society or history or culture or beliefs at the time, and which therefore, in some sense or other, seem to be bound up, seem to be intertwined with particular historical circumstances, which could be changed, therefore, as history changes. And I'm conscious that we only have a few minutes left, so I will simply share what the topic is that the Rambam discusses this, and this is a very well-known subject because it enters into the writing of the Ramban Nachmanides in his commentary on the Torah, where he takes the Rambam to task about this issue. And this is the view of Rambam Maimonides, Moreh Nevuchim, of korbanos, of sacrifices. Because what the Rambam says in his Moreh Nevuchim is that korbanos, a vast part of the Torah, the whole of Sefer Vayikra, right, the middle book of the Torah, dealing with sacrifices, the end of Sefer Shemos, dealing with the building of the Mishkan, which is the place of service of Hashem for korbanos, large sections of Bamidbar and Devarim. All of this is dealing with the ritual of sacrifice. Says the Rambam, really and truly, this doesn't represent a primary ideal method of avodas Hashem, of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There would be, in theory, in principle, better methods of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but because of Neil's two words, excellent words, the context, because of the human Mekablei HaTorah, at that time, for the Mekablei HaTorah, for the recipients of the Torah, this was the form through which Avodas Hashem had to take place, and therefore the whole system of korbanos is there. Now, I've really presented almost a parav or made more palatable version of the Rambam, because the Rambam actually says this in more extreme terms. He says the Jewish world being built by Kadosh Baruch Hu is embedded in a pagan society in which the worship of Hashem, of godly forces, is intertwined with godliness ascribed to animals, to sacrifices, to seeing the forces of nature as powerful and godly. In such a world, the only way the Jewish people could be weaned off service of these forces is through the korban system, and therefore the korban system is given as a method in Avodas Hashem of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because for the people at the time, this was a way of drawing them away from the only system of belief they knew, which was pagan. Now, the Ramban takes the Rambam to task, and unsurprisingly so. because this is a very, very troubling idea, dealing with a very significant part of the Torah. Probably, actually, if we look at the pillars of the Torah, there are really three major themes that run through a large section of the Torah: Yetzias Mitzrayim, Avodah Zarah, and Korbanos. These are three really bulk topics, along with Gemilas Chasadim and human interaction and kindness and care and so on. So one of the big themes of the Torah, the Rambam seems to be saying, is very much just a historic and cultural and circumstantial expression of the way to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And on a practical level, it also poses a series of challenges. For example, in a world in which we seem to be quite comfortable avoiding pagan practices, none of us are particularly, and there are lots of reasons why Jews struggle with their Judaism, but very few of us struggle with Judaism because of Avodah Zarah. That's not the temptation today. An atheistic world is tempting, or all sorts of other systems, but a system of polytheism, paganism, and so on, isn't a mass phenomenon anymore. It doesn't seem central to our journey, our spiritual journey. What does it mean in terms of going back to Korbanos when the Beis Hamikdash is B'miut Hashem rebuilt, in the Messianic era, the rebuilding of the restoration of the Beis Hamikdash? How does this all translate? What sense are we meant to make of all of this? So the Ramban begins posing these questions, and the truth is the Rambam himself poses these questions himself. The Rambam realized that what he was saying needed further analysis. So we're going to stop there for today. Next week, we will look at in more detail the first case study of a thinker, the Rambam, the Rishon, the Rambam, who dealt with this question, amongst many other examples, I should say, in his Mon Avachim, in which he seems to take a stance very much on one end of the spectrum in terms of our question. The same Rambam who speaks about the immutability of the Torah, who speaks about the Yesod HaTashi, the ninth principle of faith, speaks about the Torah being eternal for all time, also takes a very significant chunk of the Torah and doesn't just say that the way the principle is expressed is like damages, is through oxes and cows, but seems to say the core design of the method of Avodas Hashem is also one which is circumstantial. It's a very troubling idea and one that needs to be looked at. And the Ramban certainly disagrees with it. And it's certainly, and maybe I should make sure I say this before I finish the recording, it's certainly the consensus of Jewish thought through the generations has not been like this Rambam in his Mon Avachim, and not to present this Rambam as if it's somehow become normative in Jewish thinking. Nonetheless, it's clearly a very important Maramakim that needs to be considered and looked at. So we will stop there for excuse me, for today, and Emitz Hashem carry on next week. I would appeal to anyone who is able to, who is there on Zoom, please come back and learn face to face. It will create a buzz of live Torah learning. And thank you to all of you for those. I don't know why everyone's laughing, but thank you to all of you for coming live. If you come live, you get three advantages. You see me face to face, you get food, and you get coffee. So I'd strongly encourage everyone to come back. Thank you very much.
You deliver to Yerushalayim?
Yerushalayim is a problem, yeah. Phil, you have an exception. You're